The Atari 5200 gets no respect, and that's a shame because upon its release it offered a gaming experience unlike anything else on the market, revolutionizing consumer input methods in a number of ways. In fact, to this day, it did things that remain rarely replicated outside of authentic hardware. The Atari 5200's main input method was designed around analog controllers and a trackball. It was the first ROM-based system to do so in addition to the Vectrex, and they would essentially be the last until Sega revived the idea in limited form. The 5200 pioneered dual analog stick controls at a consumer level, something that wouldn't be offered again until the PlayStation over 20 years later. If you want a full recap of why the 5200 controller was innovative or how it impacted modern gaming, I covered it in a video, What Inspired the Modern Controller, and I highly suggest that you check it out, as we won't be recapping it here. The 5200 couldn't have launched at a worse time, releasing at the tail end of 1982. The great video game crash would hit the following year, with industry revenue dropping from over $3 billion to just over $100 million. The 5200 would sell over 1 million units during its launch period, outcompeting the ColecoVision. But with Atari hemorrhaging money, the 5200 was killed off by the close of '83 and was entirely removed from the market by May of 1984. Even with that, the system wasn't dead yet. The 5200 would see a re-release in 1986, selling an unknown number of consoles and nearly 2 million more games. It's something we'll discuss later in this very video. While the system was actively being marketed, no digital controller was available for it, meaning games not intended for analog input were miserable to play, contributing to a less than stellar reputation. We are 40 years removed from that time, and a ton of new digital and analog controller options have hit the market for the 5200, creating entirely fresh gaming experiences and a reason to revisit titles once considered lost causes. With the right controller, the 5200 does something unexpected. It continues to offer the best home gaming experience possible for numerous titles. And while the library is small at just 69 games, it may be one of the best out there quality-wise, with over half of the system's library considered above average. So if you're into retro gaming, you may be wondering if these older systems are worth looking into. When considering consoles older than the NES, it's a hard question to find a reasonable answer. For the most part, folks making recommendations do so using two different approaches. First, the person is likely to recommend games they consider groundbreaking for that era, while including some personal favorites. A game such as Space Shuttle: A Journey into Space is undoubtedly impressive. Yet I would be hard-pressed to recommend it to a more modern audience, as it's not in line with evolving standards. The same remains true with the real sports line and games such as baseball. At the time, the voice narration was impressive, but as a game today, there is zero reason to pick this up outside of historical significance or a strong sense of personal nostalgia. The second group strictly recommends games they love, and it's almost without exception from a perspective of someone who grew up with the machine or machines from that era. Clearly, there's a ton of merit with both of these methods, but neither solves the issue at hand, and that's offering recommendations that really will appeal to a broader demographic while highlighting gaming experiences that are entirely enhanced by being on the 5200. While I could recommend games like Mario Bros., Zaxxon, or Frogger, it's kind of pointless. These may be must-own games on the 5200, but consumers have easy access to better versions, making this a moot point. Of course, if someone like me is making a video like this, there's a good chance we either appreciate or loathe the era, making recommendations a bit biased. So let's back up for a second and revisit the original question. Is this system worth looking into? While you may enjoy watching the remainder of this video regardless, I want to give a clear response before we get into the games. The easiest answer I can give is by asking you if you like the Vectrex. And if the answer is yes, you'll almost certainly love the 5200, as I consider them sibling consoles. What if you've never played the Vectrex though? The 5200 is quite linear in its primary appeal, mostly replicating the early 80s single-screen arcade experience, and it does that with original games and fantastic ports. If you're into this game style, the 5200 is a must-play, must-own system that's unfairly dismissed. In my opinion, when looking at all gaming systems pre-NES, nothing comes close to the quality of the 5200 or the Vectrex. So if you're not really into 80s arcade games, nothing I say here will change that for you. The 5200 will almost certainly not change your mind, and this essentially is the case for all gaming systems pre-Master System or original Nintendo. A couple of quick notes for this video. As I run down the list of 5200 games, I'll include details showing what controller method should be used to best enjoy each gaming experience. Any marked as digital can easily be played using an emulator. For this video, I replayed every original game on original hardware to prep. However, my 5200 doesn't have the best looking video signal, so I've used emulation to capture footage when possible and will only be showing footage from real hardware when required. It should be noted, the vast majority of emulators don't support analog controls for the 5200, and while there are some workarounds, they are not straightforward. If you attempt to play games that require analog support with a digital controller, the experience will feel broken. So remember, it's not your game. This is Retro Impressions, 10 games that make the Atari 5200 worth owning. Now on to the games. Space Dungeon is without a doubt in my mind the best game on the 5200, and unfortunately, the least accessible. While it's possible to emulate this game, the workarounds are fairly complicated, and you're unlikely to find success experiencing this outside of real hardware. Space Dungeon is one of only 2 games that utilize Atari's revolutionary twin analog stick controller setup, and it's a masterpiece. While it may not be well remembered, Space Dungeon released in arcades in 1981, a year prior to Robotron 2084, making it one of, if not the very first twin-stick shooter. The game is as advertised. You're exploring a dungeon via a spaceship. It's like a cross between Robotron and the dungeons from the original Zelda on NES. For a game designed in 1981, it's really impressive and quite shocking that it's essentially ignored and forgotten. All quality of life standards are there, including a map that shows you where you've been. The gameplay isn't complex. Collect treasures to increase your point total, kill the enemy, and find the passageway to the next level. Over the years, there's been a fair amount of discussion about this game among its limited fan base, and the general consensus is that the 5200 version is not only incredible, it's better than the arcade. The 5200 is also the only direct home port. Years later, the arcade version was emulated on the PSP and was released as part of Title Legends Power Up. The unfortunate bit here is the PSP lacks a second analog stick, so the multi-directional attack is relegated to the digital face buttons. It's still very playable, but the 5200 stands tall, remaining the best way to play this iconic game. If you enjoy games like Robotron 2084, Xenocrisis, Smash TV, and similar style games, this is their grandfather, and you absolutely should experience it. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you likely know I love Moon Patrol, and feel the best home version is an aftermarket port to the Vectrex called Vector Patrol. However, if you're looking for something visually closer to the arcade, the 5200 remains the best official home port to this day. In Moon Patrol, you pilot a police buggy equipped with anti-gravity tech, allowing you to jump large craters while using laser cannons to take out those who wish Luna City harm. The game auto-scrolls left to right and has numerous checkpoints throughout each stage. Mechanically and visually, it's great. However, it should be noted that the 5200 has an incredible and active development community, so there are always new releases, hacks, patches, and at times, upgrades being made to older games. In the case of Moon Patrol, it received a refresh in 2019 by Tix over on Atari Age, which brought it visually closer to the original arcade experience. I'll leave a link to the thread if you want to check out what's called Moon Patrol Redux. I also recommend checking out other work by Tix, as they've done other graphical updates for classic console games such as Miner 2049er. I'm not sure how to describe Centipede outside of calling it a single-screen trackball shooter. Of all non-sports games, it's without a doubt the one best known for using this control method. While Centipede has been ported to a ton of systems including emulated arcade ports, none of these feel right considering how the game was designed around a trackball and not a gamepad. And that's not an uncommon issue when bringing home games with unique control requirements. With Centipede on the 5200, the user input method is near perfectly replicated, as the system has one of the best consumer-grade trackballs ever released, and it's a game changer. Quite a few Atari arcade games use the Poke sound chip, and the 5200 happens to include it. So games like Centipede are arcade accurate in the sound department. Centipede on the 5200 may not be the best looking or offer the 2-player support found in the 7800 version, but bar none, is the best release of any version save the arcade. And it's not even a contest. While the Atari 5200 pioneered the revolutionary consumer twin-stick controller, only 2 games were officially released for it: Space Dungeon and Robotron 2084. Robotron may be the best known of all classic twin-stick shooters. Robots have taken over the world, and it's your job to kill them all while saving humans for some sweet arcade points. It's an absolutely fantastic game, which has received a fair number of ports, the best being on the 7800 and 5200. Neither version is perfect, with the 5200 being the best controlling and the 7800 being the best looking. In my opinion, the 5200 port is king, but it requires 2 original analog controllers with the coupler for a proper experience, and that might not always be possible. Gryuss is a very unique shooter. It's like a cross between Stage 1 of Tempest and Galaxian. If there's such a thing as a 360-degree shooter, this is it. It's fast-paced, great fun, and visually has a design that still holds up well. The game was created by legendary designer Yoshiki Okamoto, who's best known for creating Time Pilot, Final Fight, and Street Fighter. In my opinion, Gryuss is one of the best games on the platform, and this version remains the best home port available to this day. There is a port on the NES, but it's more of a reimagined version, and in my opinion really shouldn't be compared. There's been a few clones and games heavily inspired by Gryuss, including Kepler Attack for the Apple Watch. Zone Ranger is one of the more interesting games on this list in the way that it seems to be essentially ignored. I rarely have seen it discussed, there is not a massive online presence for it, and yet it's one of the best games on the system. This is by definition easy to learn, hard to master, and that's what made great games during this era. Zone Ranger is a free roaming shooter where you need to take out malfunctioning satellites along with the robots trying to repair them. There's also asteroids floating around, and some may feel this is an asteroid-inspired game, but I really don't feel that's a valid take. Each zone is massive and requires you to track down and destroy 16 satellites before continuing to the next. The game controls great, looks fantastic, and is a blast to play. With so few details online, there's a few things you should know that may be helpful coming into this. The satellites communicate using red and green lasers. These indicate where the satellites are located, but it's important to know that the red ones can destroy your ship. You'll also be notified through sound when repair robots are en route and can take a warp hole to that area. The game was only released on Atari's 8-bit platform and the Commodore 64. I never played the Commodore version, but understand it's nearly identical with some visual downgrades, something that's fully understandable considering the C64's limitations when compared to the 5200. Gremlins is part of a very fascinating situation at Atari and with the 5200. While the system launched in 1982, the video game crash of 1983 saw Atari suffer massive financial losses. In the first quarter of 1982, they posted a profit of $100 million US. In the same quarter, in 1983, the company lost over $46 million US, putting Atari's parent company, Warner Communication, in a difficult position. Their answer was to pull out of the consumer market, splitting the company and liquidating that division. The 5200 and 2600 were both cancelled, and the new owner was located. By 1984, former Commodore executive and founder Jack Tramiel acquired a controlling stake by accepting responsibility for the nearly $250 million in outstanding debt. By the time the deal closed, Atari had been closing out their consumer gaming market for nearly a year, and Jack wanted to focus strictly on personal computers. So while the 5200 had games ready to ship in 1984, they were put in storage as the project was scrapped. Coming into 1986, the company had been liquidating what they could to make some quick money while they focused on the next generation of Atari home computers. One of these games was Gremlins, which had been partially manufactured before things shut down. The game was finished, flashed, and carts were assembled in 1984, as is reflected in-game, but none of the packaging or labels had been produced. As the story goes, the game was never intended to ship or even enter manufacturing. There was a bit of a disconnect within the company during the transfer of ownership, so it sat in storage for 2 years, and in 1986, Tramiel did something rather odd. He authorized a re-release strictly intended to dump old stock, so the 2600, 5200, and the new but outdated 7800 were all on store shelves once again at the same time, and a year later the XE would join them. One interesting thing of note is that the 5200 launched with 4 controller ports and a switch box that routed the power and game signal through the same cable. Shortly after launch, the system was revised to a 2-port model with separate cords for the game signal and power. So when they relaunched it in 1986, it was a bit shocking to see the return of the 4-port version, but this wasn't a real relaunch. This was a liquidation of leftover stock, and none of the finished games that were not ready in some state of manufacturing would be re-released. In total, nearly 2 million 5200 games would be sold from 1986 until 1989, with Gremlins being the only one not previously available. Any game released during this period that had not finished the manufacturing process had a 1986 copyright by Atari Corp rather than Atari Inc., in addition to some label alterations. So yeah, the 5200 would make one of the best unreleased video series possible, as many games were finished or close to completion and never released. So what about Gremlins? This is an exclusive and original game to the system. You're a kid named Billy, and it's your job to kill gremlins on site while saving the Mogwai. You'd be hard-pressed to find a 5200 enthusiast that doesn't have this gem in their top 10, and for good reason. It's quite fun, looks great, and has genuine personality. Each stage is a single screen with the same objective: save all the Mogwai possible before they turn to gremlins, and kill the rest with your massive sword. The gameplay is solid, but it's the little things such as the water multiplying Mogwai, their insistence on getting food from the fridge, and the distraction the TV causes that gives the game personality. I don't recall a lot about the movie, but it seems to keep in line with expectations set by that film, and for an early 80s game, that's doing more than most. Gaming in the 80s was an incredibly unique era. If there was a popular game such as Berzerk, someone out there would almost certainly make a clone if that game wasn't available on their console of choice. In this case, you have Robot for the ZX Spectrum, Robot Wars on the MSX, Robot Killer for the Emerson Arcadia 2001, and K-Razy Shootout for the 5200. I bring this up because it's not often that we see clones of games on a system where the original game is also available. K-Razy Shootout is a solid affair, but it's not of the caliber or quality the original is known for. Berzerk is a single-stick, fixed-screen maze multi-directional shooter that was one of the first games to include speech. The first game to include speech was the Space Invaders-inspired Speak and Rescue, released in May of 1980.
Help me! We'll be back.
Berzerk would release that same year in November, so the tech was quite new for this application type. While it was officially ported to the 2600, Vectrex, and 5200, only the 5200 includes the speech, as the 5200 was the first consumer gaming console to do so without the need of additional hardware expansions. In fact, Real Sports Baseball also had speech and was released in 1982 for the 5200, but we won't be discussing that here.
Strike 3, you're out.
Berzerk is a fantastic port, in addition to being an impressive showcase of the 5200 platform. This remains the best home port of this game, and is absolutely a must-own for anyone with a 5200.
Chicken, fight like a robot.
I consider Dreadnaught Factor to be a vertical scrolling boss rush shooter. I really haven't a clue how else to describe this. You're in a small ship and need to take down massive dreadnoughts before they reach the Stargate. There isn't really a story here, but according to the manual, these ships are the size of a star, and there's a whole fleet of them. You'll essentially do run after run trying to take out the ship's weapons, defense, engines, and control stations. There's strategy to be had here too, and everything you do has an impact. Take out the engines and the dreadnought slows to a crawl, or take out the bridge to drop the ship's attack ability in half. There's plenty of avenues, and while it's simple at first, the real trick is learning to navigate the screen, avoid incoming fire, and properly hit your targets before missing the opportunity. The game was originally designed and released on the Intellivision as a side-scroller, so the 5200 is a full rework from top to bottom, and it's by far the better of the two games. The game also takes advantage of the 5200 analog controller, which allows the user to control their thrust. Quicks doesn't seem like a game that should be on this list or any list concerning a top 10 for just about anything. The concept is straightforward. There is a large space and you have to section off the required percentage without dying, and you win that stage. Quicks is your main opponent and is intent on killing you before you can claim the required space. If this game sounds familiar yet you've never played it, that's due to the incredibly high number of clones that exist. It's often considered one of the most cloned games ever, and I'm not talking about homebrews, but commercial releases. I even played a few of them before learning about this game, and even now, it continues to inspire new releases such as the immensely popular Paper IO series. Quicks has been ported to a ton of systems, so like most games for the 5200, we need to ask what version offers the best option. The answer is complicated, and while there are way too many to cover here, if you are looking for the best version similar to the arcade release, then the 5200 and Game Boy take the cake. It's a bit of an oddity considering the simplicity of the graphics, but no other system focusing on the original game seems to have nailed it. For the Game Boy release, Nintendo did the development in-house and it's excellent. But it's also a handheld game. For home consoles, the 5200 is the one you want. And it's a game that's really worth playing. So, while we covered 10 games, it's not to say that these are the 10 best games. That's something I hope to cover in another video, but these are certainly 10 games that make the 5200 worth owning. This list could have easily been 20 games long, and still left out a handful worth discussing. Games such as Defender, Ball Blazer, Miner 2049er, and Star Raiders were a few that I really wanted to talk about, but ended up cutting from this video in favor of games I felt fit the topic better. Having played every official 5200 game, I can say that over a third of the library should be considered must-own, while over half of the games are above average, offering a solid experience. If you had to recommend Atari 5200 games to someone, what would your list look like? Let me know below. That's it for now, and until next time, thank you for watching Retro Impressions.